An officer had just been murdered. He gave a knife to a Latino inmate to stab a black inmate. The Latino inmate gave the knife to the black inmate and said, "Hey, this guy wanted me to murder you, and I don't work for the police." Then that guy murdered him.
What's up, everyone? This is Justin Kahn. Welcome to the podcast, The Quest, where I dive into the ups and downs of trailblazers around me to help you figure out life and get to where you want to be. Before we start, bang that subscribe button for unfiltered conversations on tech, entertainment, and wellness, dropping every Tuesday. Today, my guest is Prophet Walker, ex-convict turned community leader. Imagine speaking at the State of the Union as a guest of Michelle Obama after spending 6 years behind bars. We dive into the behind the scenes of Prophet's story, going to jail, making mistakes, and now how he's starting a startup. Please enjoy. All right, Prophet, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good. Merry Christmas. I had a pretty good holiday so far.
Did you get anything you wanted for Christmas?
I didn't. I haven't really well, actually, that's not true. I got some cashmere sweatpants for my wife, which are very comfortable.
Those are comfy sweatpants. That's a pro move for sure.
It's something I didn't even know I wanted.
Are they like James Purse or something?
They're from this Mongolian brand called Gobi.
Okay.
Yeah. Pretty comfortable.
I have not gotten myself any, but I walked into a James Purse store and they had cashmere sweatpants, and I was like, I see how these are comfortable.
That's super luxe.
Yeah, I walked out without them because
they're probably like $500.
Correct. And there's no way to justify buying sweatpants in my mind. But
yeah. All right. Cool. So ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
So by this time I'll have introduced you. I'll do the intro and let people have some context. I'll just start and I'll, what I want to do in the conversation, just go through your background and then also, kind of your whole interesting life story, and then go into Treehouse and talk about a little bit about Treehouse, and then we can just go wherever it takes, takes you, us, and I have a pretty good sense of what people are interested in. They're just, I try to cover, new ideas and facilitate an opportunity for people to learn something. So there's that, and then we can edit afterwards. So if there's something that you're not comfortable with or whatever, I'll send you a draft, and you can always edit it later.
Okay, perfect.
And the conversation is pretty, I edit it pretty heavily in terms of, if there's parts downtime or hiccups or whatever, take that out. Or if there's just a part where we just went off the rails and talked about something that's not generally interesting, it's just probably interesting to you and I, and then,
right.
Monk, cashmere sweatpants or something
Correct.
I'll probably edit that out. Yeah. Cool. All right, Prophet. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, man.
So I want to start at the beginning, and I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about where you grew up and where you're from.
Yeah, so I grew up in Watts, South Central LA, which was a pretty interesting place to grow up in the early 80s and 90s. We were sort of at the height of the war on drug and all its adverse effects to communities like it. A lot of the super predator laws had just passed. I had no idea that they'd eventually impact me. But it otherwise was when you think of Watts and you think of South Central, you're immediately sort of struck by this idea of blood and Crips, crack cocaine, police occupation, or depending which side you see it from, law enforcement, saving the community, and a lot of heartbreak. But the perspective I had was a bit different. Certainly all those things existed because poverty existed. And as a result of poverty comes with a host of ill effects. But what was undeniable for me growing up in this place was just an incredible sense of community that was there. People out of sheer need worked with one another quite a bit. Um, so that's where I grew up.
Did did the war on drugs? How did you feel? Did you feel that the war on drugs affected you when you were growing up?
Oh, certainly. Like the war on drugs was this sort of uh, implicit and very explicit attack on, frankly, the community I grew up in. There was, on one end, I think I saw someone said this before, but they were like, look, I've never seen a poppy plant in South Central. And that's real, right? Like I've
Yeah.
never seen one grow there. But yet, South LA and many other communities like it were filled with cocaine, and which ultimately got cut down to crack cocaine. And we've since learned stuff like the Iran Contra scandal and how we were funding wars with a lot of drug money. In particular, Los Angeles. I think the story of Rick Ross is a pretty incredible one to think about how the government worked pretty uh, consistently and cohesively with drug dealers in South LA. And I could feel the impacts of police occupation. You know, after when you grow up in South LA, you have this mantra of like, I I have to get out of the hood. I have to get out of the hood. I have to get out of the hood. And I had the exact same mantra. And when I did, I moved to Playa Vista, and it's as safe as you could get, as cookie cutter as you could get, as much wealth, maybe not as much as Beverly Hills, but certainly a lot of new money wealth in technology. And I don't think my daughter's ever interacted with a law enforcement agent in growing up in that
Yeah.
environment. And I don't think she's ever been safer. And growing up in the war on drugs, like there was a constant police presence. There was a constant sort of, I guess, like a stench of just heartache that existed around me. I could see this combination of mothers existing in this duality of hopelessness and hopefulness. So the hopelessness for their own lives and the reality that they had grown up with and impacted by the drugs in the 70s and the 80s, but a hopefulness that their children would somehow make it out of this mess. And it was never lost on me that uh, many of the laws that were passed during the crack cocaine epidemic, of recent, we've heard, whether it was Hillary Clinton or whatever other more liberal leaning politician run for any major public office, get pretty aggressive critiques for using words like super predators, etc. And that was directly pointed to me and my generation. The super predators were the children born of mothers like mine, who was a full heroin addict. And it was there was a presupposition that uh, whatever shit she was, sorry, whatever she was shooting in her veins would somehow send me awry and make me a super predator, which I think's pretty funny.
That,
Actually, have
that's
you
a
seen the movie Zoolander?
yeah.
It's literally the way that movie's an incredible critique on our society, particularly around the war on drugs and how they position the predator and they become rabid, and how to protect against the protect our society against the predator without understanding their plight.
It's a very American, or very uh, kind of Puritan idea, actually, that there's this kind of original sin that that in these children who are born in the hood to, like, family that's maybe with parents addicted to drugs, and there's like no hope, and then we just have to protect ourselves from these people.
Right. Yeah.
How? So what was that? I mean, how did that? Like, I guess you talked a little bit about your parents maybe hoping something, or parents generally in where you're from hoping something for better for their children. Was that the case for your family? Like, were your parents hoping that you would make it out of the hood? And did they see a specific path for you there?
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother named me Prophet, so she was pretty presumptuous. She was leaning into the idea of this dude needs to figure something out for us all. But yeah, certainly my dad is this incredible example of sort of rugged entrepreneurship and masculinity, in that the thought of the US government taking care of his family through welfare or otherwise, like, repulsed him to no end. Um, and not because he believed that subsidies wasn't important, because he completely did and was able to articulate, like, in the face of systematic poverty, there should be a pittance for everyone's you know effective upside as a result of this for people. But he hated the idea that uh, a government that did not see him as human, and he grew up being called a boy and disrespected and disallowed from different places, and my grandfather experienced just overt terrible racism. And in fact, my mother, uh, her family completely, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Completely disenfranchised her from the family for being with my father. And so he experienced
Was your
this.
mother white?
My mother's white, yeah.
Oh,
My mother's white, and I actually have, uh, uh, my great great grandparents, I guess, were all part of the KKK, and this wild, uh, sort of American realities here. Um, but my dad just disliked the idea of a government as he saw it that didn't consider him human, even beginning to have a say in his family's life. And so he worked extremely hard, owned his own small construction business, and was really big on how do I provide for myself and my community. And I think one of the craziest examples of duality that I saw was my uncle, who was addicted to crack cocaine, and it's my dad's brother, and he was homeless, and he was choosing to be homeless, frankly, because I think there was a tremendous amount of shame, etc., shrouded in this. But my dad, every single night that we ate, after we ate, my dad would make a plate and get me in the car, and we would go look for my uncle and sit with him and make sure he ate that night. And
wow.
it was just such a, my entire life, every single night, did not fail. And my uncle's now 10 years sober and incredible. But my dad, like, treated him with such incredible humanity and love. And he didn't stigmatize homelessness or the ills of our community. Instead, he recognized that there was something significantly bigger at play that was, not to our advantage. And so therefore, he he felt compelled to do something about it. And I think that's the, like, so on one end, I could feel the impacts of the war on drugs very directly in my own family, in my own community, and I would see law enforcement, jack guys up and just pull you over, and it became expected that once my sort of rite of passage. I was actually speaking with Jesse and Emmett about this idea of, like, males should have an actual ritualized rites of passage more to usher them into male deportment with women, etc. And I think my rite of passage, a part of it was to learn to navigate and code switch, if you will, um, with law enforcement and other folks that didn't see me as particularly productive. And
Well, that's fucking terrible. One, and two, it's interesting that to me that you've kind of lived that for decades, and then now it's very top of mind for the American public, right? In the past 4 years, maybe, or something like
right,
that, right? 4 or 5 years,
right.
and especially in 2020. Do you like? Well, I guess what's that like as a black man in America, where you feel like that is something that's very prevalent? It's like in the community, you feel like this is the rite of passage for, for worse. I guess I was going to say for better, for worse, but it's like obviously, that's a pretty tough reality to admit, almost, that this is reality. And you were going through that for for years, decades, right? Like, what does that feel like?
It's interesting. I actually began to resent it in my father, because the first time I didn't understand that like the word code switching or the words code switching that was irrelevant to me as a kid, but there was something like viscerally activated in me when I would watch my dad be this joyous, uh, funny, rambunctious guy among friends and family. And then we would interact with, our white counterparts. And there was an immediate deference that sometimes felt emasculating, frankly. And he would change the deflection of his voice, and he would try and find in some, I don't know, pool of knowledge in his brain how to speak and comport and assimilate himself to the culture that he felt expected to be. And I would watch this as a kid, and I remember just telling him, like, Dad, why are you changing your voice for these people? like stop. And my dad dislikes rap music generally.
Yeah.
It's been a long sell, but we would be listening to like the Temptations and like Smokey Robinson and Stevie Wonder, and just like loving life and having a joyous time. And then he'd see law enforcement and like turn his music down, and I'd be like, fuck, like this sucks. Like we're not even
Yeah.
doing anything remotely offensive here. And so I think I had always been really, really mindful of this. And as I got older, there's certainly like a culture, uh, a more culturally accepted way among different groups that you interact with and the way you speak. Like when I play Dungeons and Dragons, I don't talk the way or speak the way I speak on a basketball court, right? Like there's just a difference in deportment there. But um, growing up and watching that difference happen sheerly because the person had white skin and our authority, or the presumption of authority, really made me frankly despise authority, in its sort of symbolism in America.
I get that. It makes me think of my mom, actually, who I remember she would always be very cautious of like what she said to other people, and her
Right.
mannerisms would change. My mom was an immigrant. She came to this country when she was 17. She actually speaks English like perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But when she was talking to, her relatives or like other, people from, Asian immigrants, she would have one, accent that was like more like broken English or like more relatable,
Right.
basically where they were at in their English. And then when she was speaking to like white people at a business, she would talk in an entirely different way. That was, the professional, like my perfect English
Right.
way. And it occurred, I used to hate that because I thought it was so
Right.
fake, but I didn't really understand the context of like, you're trying to make the other people comfortable.
Correct.
And I imagine that's like doubly hard when you're a black man in America, and like it's like feels more. It's not just a matter of like I'm trying to make them comfortable, but it's like I'm trying to like make them comfortable so that something bad doesn't happen, like the
Occur to me.
situation doesn't go south.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
and
think there's like
it,
I can only imagine your mom being, to your point, just switching up conversation. It's driven by like fear of a negative thing happen. It's, wanting to fit in. It's wanting to prove that like you have the intellectual prowess or otherwise to fit in a room. But it's all like coming from this place of lack and not abundance. And I think very early on I was like, man, this isn't cool.
yeah. I have that. I feel that way too. I remember one time my mom and I were walking into a government building. It was like
Hmm.
to get a photo ID or something or file some paperwork, and I was like talking about, I was, a kid, probably 11 years old, and I was talking about like bombs or something or blowing something up, right? And my mom was like, "Don't say that, like here. You can't
Right.
talk about, you know, whatever violent, anything violent or guns or bombs, like here. Like you have to." And she was very paranoid about the government because her family had escaped China in during kind of
Wow.
the 50s,
Hmm.
and so she was very her parents were very paranoid about the government, about governments in general, and she was very paranoid. And so I remember that was a very formative experience where I was like, oh, I need to watch what I say around certain areas or people, or whatever, even if I'm not doing anything wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's
Um,
that's a and then you look at like your counterparts and you're like, wait, they're like idolizing Clint Eastwood shooting everybody up. And that's
yeah,
okay. Like I wanna like I remember we couldn't play with in my childhood I couldn't play with water guns. A fucking kid can't play with water guns. Like it's crazy.
yeah,
Couldn't play with water guns. The like cap guns, couldn't play with cap guns. Couldn't play with Nerf gun. Anything that had a gun in it, we were like fundamentally disallowed to touch. And it was all out of you need to walk this road this way or else. And even if you walk this road this way, it still may go bad for you. And so here's another layer of I don't know, comportment that you can try and deploy in the case of something goes wrong. It was like always these
right.
multi-tiered plans that you learned. Fascinating.
So what was your plan for, when you were in high school or when you were growing up? What was your plan to get out of the hood? And like, what do you see for your life?
Yeah. So man, I had many plans, but I was looking for all of them. I would try and play every sport possible. I would, skateboard. I was not really good at singing or musically inclined at the time, but I for sure thought like I would either play sports. My dad had this small construction company, and I just thought he was like hiring incredibly wrong. I thought he had like a great opportunity, but the people he kept hiring were basically people who otherwise would end up on the streets, but he would give them an opportunity and give them a skill set and to remodel a 3-bedroom home that should take you 6 weeks to 8 weeks at production. It's taken him like four months, and I'm like, it's the people you're hiring.
Yeah.
And so I think very early on I was like, oh man, I really want to um I want to build a a successful construction business, honestly, because it's what my family, what I saw from my family. The selling drugs and all that around me was like enticing because they seemed to just have life together, frankly, right? They had the cars, they had the money. There was a bit of a cavalier approach to life that seemed peaceful, frankly. And so that
Huh.
that was that was interesting, like the when the big drug dealer rose up, it's almost less about um the what they have necessarily, like, oh, it's just a car. They have a fancy car. It's more of like this guy is not subsisting, right? And
Right. He's
he's
thriving.
thriving. Yeah. And so that was always like in the back of my head. I like, man, and I remember telling my sister, I think I was in high school, and I was like, Brittany, like either I'm gonna figure out how to be an incredibly successful businessman, or I probably am gonna be subject to the life that this guy has in drug dealing. But I'm gonna get us out of this mess one way or the other. Um, And I think it was limited to that, man, in high school. It was just like, I want out and I can get out through sports. Maybe I didn't see engineers around me. I didn't see, the closest to an engineer was my dad, who, figured out things on the fly and was building these buildings. And by the time I was 16, he had taught me how to build a house ground up. And so I had this interesting, like, set of knowledge as a young kid because of him. And he was really big on, like, his favorite quote was, I'd rather have a little of my own than a lot of someone else's. And that was like deeply rooted in knowledge mostly. It was like I
Yeah.
would rather have a depth of knowledge that's mine than um, just everyone else's opinions and ideas of what I should and shouldn't be. And so, yeah, growing up, man, I just wanted, honestly, I just wanted out. I wanted some of the some of the pain that I saw sheerly because of poverty, and not anything else, is what I wanted to end. Um, and I think in high school I started to, like, see that I was good at math and I was good in, the resultant disciplines if you're good at math. So, some level of science, some level of, philosophy, and the ability to joust and debate back and forth and retain information were things that I clearly seemed to gravitate toward. But I also struggled with uh, reading, which came with its struggles at higher level math, right? Some of the concepts. Um, so just, yeah, like, intellectually it seemed a little far fetched. I wanted to be an architect too, but that was
Yeah.
just like base level. I was able to draw what I could see, but I wasn't like the most creative. So I was like, man, I'm gonna end up a very starving artist here if I if I go this route. But all those dreams were halted, man, when I was 16. Yeah, I ended up being incarcerated. Uh, but yeah,
So tell me the story of how that happened.
yeah, for sure. So I was I was 16 years old. I gotten into high school, and I think my high school experience is an important one to sort of contextualize around all of this. I go I get accepted to a high school called Grant High School, which is in the valley of Los Angeles. And I'm excited. I'm like, okay, I'm this is step one on my way of getting my family out of the hood.
Is this
And
like what high school you have to test into or something like
yeah,
that?
you had to be a part of their magnet program. And so I was being bused an hour and a half away. It was great. I was like, it's perfect. This is my ticket out. And I get there and it's great. Like I'm going to school with like Bobby Brown's son and all of this stuff. I'm like, this is perfect. And I'm playing sports, so much fun. And then I learn in a very brute force way about the Turkish genocide, which I knew nothing about to this point. Like my only interaction with people in the world, frankly, were I had Caucasian people because I'm half white, and then Latino and black. Like that's it, and
Yeah.
Cambodians because they grew up near me. But outside of that, like that's it. Well, I am. I roll up to Grand High School, and there's a huge Armenian population that goes there. Um, and right around October, I believe, is sort of either the remembrance of the Turkish genocide, I believe, and a desire for America to recognize the atrocities of it. And oh man, adolescents with angst and a feeling of that they've been done wrong is a scary thing.
There's a lot
Sometimes
of emotional
a
energy.
lot of emotional energy. And so our school was literally divided between Armenian and American. Um, and you could see this on YouTube. Like there were police scrimmage lines in literally splitting our school in the quad in half because there'd be all these different riots and Armenian kids would jump American kids. And I remember sending a few of my friends to the hospital with concussions, and then American kids would jump them. And that was just our whole existence. My first year in high school. I'm coming in hot. Um,
Huh. So it's interesting. It's kind of like kids will make anything to divide themselves and like create groups, right? Because I mean, it's not like Americans are widely knowledgeable or have an opinion on
at
whether we
all.
should recognize the Turkish genocide
At
of
all.
Armenians.
Like literally,
Yeah,
I had zero clue, as did all of my friends. Like we
yeah,
learned as we're like fighting each other, occasionally we'd be at the lunch tables and be like, guys, exactly why are we upset with each other? And then there became this like history lesson about it. And after my middle of my second semester there, um, was kids were getting jumped and it just was really, really bad. And my family ultimately chose to take me out of the school. Too many, frankly, like Black and Latino kids were getting brutally, brutally hurt. Because there's also a college right next to the high school, a community college, and a lot of the adults were coming over as well to the school. And so my family took me out of that school and then sent me to a school in South LA, which was my home school.
yeah.
The worst idea they could have had. Because in going to that school, everything my dad had basically protected me from in this up until this point, I learned, right? So I learned every single gang in Los Angeles. I learned uh, how to shoot dice, and I learned that like kids cursed at their parents. Like I was shocked at this. I'm like 10th
Yeah.
grade being like, wait, you guys do that? My dad would murder me, like literally murder me. And it was just like this big, mask off of my eyes of the depth of the world I had been living in. Um, and I had been exposed like as a kid, my mother being a heroin addict and shooting up in front of me. But that was just more of like a parent failing you, and it seemed not necessarily my fault, right?
Right.
But this was like I had full discretion. It seemed to go one or the other ways, And that was a pivotal moment in going to that school. I picked up friends that weren't necessarily the best for me. Um, and also a bit of a rebellious streak that became in me, and just realizing, like, hearing their stories and like seeing them exist in poverty and not being able to feed themselves, and um, some of their parents being terrible. This all just became like a big eye-opening experience for me. And then um, in going to school in this area, one day I decided to ditch school. Um,
Yeah.
and it was a group of us, and we're like, oh, we're gonna go to the beach. At this point in South LA in 2004, um, something I learned later while incarcerated is that there was a black gang in South LA that had stolen about 20 plus $1 million in drugs from the Mexican mafia. And their the gang and the Mexican mafia war continued to escalate. And so first the Mexican mafia sort of limited it to this black gang and said, we're going to keep attacking you until you give us our money back. They didn't get their money back. And then it became, okay, we're going to attack this adjacent gang. They didn't get their money back. And then it became, okay, any black kid that wears a long white t-shirt, that wears baggy jeans, they're also now greenlit. And the climate in LA at that time between race relations between Latinos and blacks was incredibly strenuous. Which was a bummer because my entire life, like, I had grown up with Latinos, and they're to this day are some of my best friends. But now we were in a different world that wasn't even being governed by us, and that was a tough moment in South LA. We fought all the time. They jump us, we jump them. It was, fighting constantly, and I had picked up this a bit of anger with my mom. Frankly, being half black and half white, I struggled with insecurities of never being black enough and never being white enough. I was like, white people look at me as, uh, in my mind, I was like, white people look at me as uh, this well-spoken person, but not quite like them, and black people uh, looked at me as not being uh, necessarily, I guess, entrenched in the struggle, because there
Yeah.
were there were inherent privileges that I had of being lighter or fair complected that they didn't have, and and that was a struggle I oscillated between, and then at the so when this sort of war between Latinos and blacks started happening, I think in some ways this was like also my moment, um, to prove myself, really. And,
Yeah.
a fight happened. I was like, we're fighting today, I guess. And then I'd run a math class and sit with my teacher and be like, teach me more. And then I'd walk out of class and there'd be a fight. And so one day we decided to ditch to get away from all the madness that was happening. And our plan was to go to the beach in Redondo Beach in LA, and we take the train. And so we jump on the train, and I'm with two of my friends. Um, and one of my friends he was not uh, the sweetest of them all. And so he would see like Latino guys and be very upset, and just like, if they looked at him or anything, like, fuck are you looking at? And uh, we're on the train. There were a couple like moments of um, negative interactions with different people along the way, from what are you looking at to actively bumping into people and being stupid, just terrible like young kid bravado for no reason. And then we got to the literal last stop. It was like the last stop. And we were a 5 minute walk away from the beach. Um, yeah. And uh, I asked a kid who was on the bus, he had three of his friends. They were all Latino kids. And I asked them, "What time is it?" His response to me was, "Fuck you, pinche mayate," which is FUU N word, or black monkey, however you want to translate it. It wasn't good. And I knew that.
Yeah.
I'd learned enough to know that. And it was impulsive reaction from there. I hit him. My friends jumped in with his friends, and off we went, a full fight. And when I hit the gentleman, um, I fractured his jaw at that time, and he had a CD player. Back then, we had the Discman CD players, and that was taken and broken, and yeah, literally like $2, I think. And yeah, it was a terribly small amount of money that was also taken and ripped. Um, and his friends ran, and then uh, um, he was like engaged physically with myself and my crime partners. We kept hitting him, and then eventually he ran and we ran. And honestly, man, if I'm being honest now, that felt like a normal day in South LA.
Yeah.
It felt like, I'd go home and my dad would be like, "What happened? How was your day today?" And I was going to say, "Great." And, it didn't seem, I didn't understand the full impact of that I do now, of like, I, despite all of these externalities of our existence, like Victor was harmed, and let's take out his name, but
Yeah.
he's a friend now. But he was harmed and like lost some sense of security that he otherwise operated in as a human, just being on this earth. And that weighed on me a lot as an adult. But as a kid, it was just like this is a normal day. Um, he said something crazy that he shouldn't have said, and we responded. Like that was the mindset. And I remember we got back on the train. Needless to say, we never made it to the beach. Um, we got back on the train and decided to just go back home. In doing
Yeah.
so, um, I was the only clown that day that purchased a train ticket. My two buddies decided not to purchase a train ticket because that's also the cool thing to do, I guess, as a teenager. Um, and we got off at our stop near our house, and sure enough, there was a police checkpoint checking people for their tickets. And I got off and I walked straight through, um, and went home that day. Unfortunately, they freaked out because they didn't have a ticket, and they walked the opposite direction, and law enforcement saw them, um, and that was the end of that. They got arrested, and one of the gentlemen had uh, a Hollywood like prop gun in his backpack, um, which didn't play any particular relevance into what had happened, but I guess he had gotten it the night before or so, and so that was enough probable cause to take them in. And after
A
that,
prop gun.
yeah, so it's effectively a real gun that's they dismantle entirely. It's like unusable. Um,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
But it's like looks like a real
Oh,
gun.
it is. The shell of it is a real gun, but they
Yeah.
take out I actually don't know. There's two things in the world I don't know much about at all and don't really care to know. It's how to fix a car and guns. So I don't really
Right.
know. Oh, and seafood because I'm allergic. But so I can't really tell you the intricacies of this gun. But I, as I understand it, is there's a pin missing is what
Yeah.
delineates a prop gun from not. Um, and so they gave probable cause for them to be arrested, and after much interrogation, um, this was like terrible police work. They placed 23 charges of robbery and armed robbery on a train on those guys and said, we're going to sentence you to all of these if you don't tell us what you were doing on the train. Um, and 2 weeks later, they told the truth and shared that I was a part of it. And 2 weeks later, I got picked up. And that began a whole new journey. That in California, until recently, which I am very proud to have been extremely active in getting George Gascon elected here. I know there's some feelings in the Bay Area, but I was very active and proudly active to get him elected um, because he has officially ended uh, trying children as adults in Los
Yeah.
Angeles. And but at the time, the way to try a child as an adult was based on these five criteria, which one was whether or not the child could be rehabilitated, how many attempts had the court, and that was a psychological determination. Then it was how many attempts had the court tried to rehabilitate the minor. Was there any available programs that could provide rehabilitation services? The sophistication of the crime that the child had committed, and the gravity of the crime. And in order to send a kid to adult court, they basically had to prove that they were what's called unfit to remain in juvenile court based on this five criteria. And that was probably the first moment where I started to pay attention to law and reading like no other. Um, because there was something very fascinating about this law. And it was that in determining whether a child was um, fit to remain in juvenile court or unfit and therefore should be bided over to adult court, it was all under the presupposition that all of the alleged offenses were true, which is
Yeah.
inherently against our Constitution, which says that you're innocent until proven guilty. But for the
Right.
but for the determination of whether or not they go to adult court, it's under the presupposition that it's all true. And so tacking on 23 cases that had never been anything remotely close to us was incredibly strategic by the district attorney. Because you take 23 cases that are seemingly similar to
Yep.
the crime that was admitted to. You then place this five criteria that a judge has to determine from. And almost always, the gravity of the crime is the nail that sends you to adult court. And it's not best, 3 out of 5. It's you have to be fit for all five, or else you go to adult court. And so if you look at 23 robberies and assaults and thefts, the gravity of the crime is assumed like, yeah, under the presupposition that they did all of this, they all should go to adult court. They're like, Satan himself. Um, and that I remember the day that they said, "Yep, we find him on the fifth criteria. unfit to be a juvenile. And so therefore he goes to adult court, which is massive because my crime that I admitted to under juvenile law would have maybe gotten me 6 months probation and our
Yeah.
camp. But under adult law, there's federal mandatory minimums and maximums that were passed under super predator laws. And once you become an adult, it doesn't matter if they see you as a kid or not. There's a federal mandatory minimum that you will be sentenced to. And I remember getting invited over to adult court. My arraignment day, 22 charges dropped. Boom, gone. But the one I admitted to stayed. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go back to adult or juvenile court. Once that decision's made, it's made. And so now I face the mandatory minimum sentence of 6 years in prison and a mandatory maximum of 25 to life. And I was 16 years old. And at the height of all of my decision making as well, I had a baby girl on the way. And I remember just feeling frankly pretty crushed. Like, man, I've just like single-handedly in the matter of a month checked off every negative black stereotype you could get. And off I went into the grinder of our judicial system from there, and fighting my case for almost a year before taking a deal of 6 years.
So you took the mandatory minimum, 6 years, and you served all that time.
I served 5.5 of those years. Yeah, they did. I guess it's like 85% completion. So if you're good, basically for good time, then you can serve about 85% of your time. So I exactly served 5 years, 3 months, and 23 days to be precise.
Still remember it. So, man, I have so many questions. Like, what was it like to go in and like that day, you're like, oh, shit, I'm going to have to go to jail for 6 years. What is that like?
So it's a buildup, actually. So I've written about this. I used to write my daughter every day. And there's different tiers, right? So I remember the first day I walked into juvenile hall, and there was a kid who I was like, man, how long have you been here? Like, because he was like, I've been here for a little bit. I've been, waiting for court. And I was like, how long have you been here? And he was like, 2 weeks. And I was like, oh, they could keep you for 2 weeks? Like, what are you saying? It like 2 weeks was so incomprehensible to me. I was like, there's no way. Like, my dad is going to blow the doors off of this place. They're not going to keep me for 2 weeks. And then I'd go to court, and then I'd be, 2 weeks would pass, and okay, if 6 months, like that's the most that they could give. Like, there's no way. And I was around a group of people. We were called the unfit unit. And it's a juvenile hall facility within the juvenile hall that's just for kids being tried as an adult. And a lot of the kids around me were getting life in prison. And so that started to
Holy shit.
Yeah, a lot of kids. Like one of, a kid who I knew, inside got 140 years to life plus life. So many kids were getting life in prison. They were.
What did he do?
He was inside of a car that killed, frankly, a couple of my friends growing up. But the adults were the shooters. He was the driver. He was 14 when this happened. And it's, that was the reality. And separately, when COVID ends, if ever you're interested in going to the unfit unit and hearing some of the kids' stories, I still go and um, hang out with them occasionally when I can. And you're
Yeah.
welcome to roll with me. Um, but
Oh,
it was I started to become desensitized by the time. And then the day I was sentenced, or sorry, the day that I took accepted my deal, um, I remember I was sitting in court and I looked back and my dad was late and I was like, oh, this is not normal. Um, and then he came and um, I look back and he sort of symbolized like a cradle. And then my attorney leaned over and said, oh, yeah, your family wanted me to tell you your daughter was born last night. Um, yeah, and at 16, life just became very serious to me. And the prospect of potentially being sentenced to 25 years to life just was, couldn't even fathom it. My dad had been such a tremendous part of frankly, saving me, that the idea that I wouldn't be with my daughter was just too staggering, honestly. And so I asked my attorney, like, hey, do you think that they would give me a deal for whatever the minimum amount of time is that you could get? And she went and talked to them, and they said, look, the minimum would be 6 years. Um, and I'd been in for a year, and I was like, okay, or I guess like 9, 10 months, whatever it was, before she was 8 months. I've been in for 8 months because her mom was a month pregnant. Um, yeah, and I was like, whatever the minimum is with time served, I'll take it, and I should be home, when she's 4 or 5 years old, and at least I could still be an important piece of her life. And my attorney's position was, well, maybe we could get less, but we do run the risk of you getting more, and just the risk of that was crazy. And I had already admitted what I'd done. It wasn't like we were going to uncover some new information. It was just a matter
right.
of, like, frankly, political jockeying of whether or not I can somehow thwart the system and decrease time. Um, and so I remember asking for that. They gave it to me. And the day I was sentenced, man, I remember just like a terrible despair of, like, this place had become, like my cemetery almost. I think I
Yeah.
resonated. Someone wrote before that in this moment, the jumpsuit felt like my casket, and the courtroom my mortuary. And that's exactly, I felt that completely. And then afterwards, uh, after I gathered myself, I remember talking to one of my best friends, um, Scott Butnick, who happened to be the creator of the Hangover movies. And talking to him, he was a volunteer in juvenile hall. And at the time, he was just an assistant in Hollywood and in his early 20s, maybe 20, 21. Um, and I remember crying and being like, man, all my friends are like going to the prom and all of this stuff. And he was like, and I was like, I should be there. I should be in college. And he was like, dude, shut up and do something about it. Don't cry about it. Which is hyper masculine in today's time. But
Yeah.
back then, and certainly in the context that I was under, I was like, you're right. Um, and that led me to just like actively thinking about how both I could change my life in these circumstances, and then how I could also begin to extend and change the plight of many people around me, which we end up doing, starting a college program there.
So how did you pass the time? I guess, how did you survive the 5.5 years?
Yeah, so passing the time was initially it was I was young, I was petrified when I walked into prison. At the time I was there, an officer had just been murdered, and he was murdered because he gave a knife to another inmate to stab a black inmate. He gave a knife to a Latino inmate to stab a black inmate. The Latino inmate gave the knife to the black inmate and said, "Hey, this guy wanted me to murder you, and I don't work for the police." And then that guy murdered him. And it's, you could look up 2005 Chino officer murdered. And I was like in the prison when this, I'm 18. Could you imagine
Yeah.
your mindset at 18? Like this is what just happened at 18. And I'm like, I'm in the fucking theater of the absurd. Like, what is happening right
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
And so I'd say my first 9 months, I don't know, 9 months to a year was all about like getting my sea legs in this new world. And I stopped trying to like buck against reality and instead just like accept my reality for what it was and then create from there, and not operate from a place of deficit. And that was my first 9 months. And, my first interaction was a guy telling me that I had to stab someone, that it was my turn. And because I was the lowest on the totem pole and the youngest, that's what I had to do.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying that, and I was like, "No, I don't want to do that. I don't even know the guy." And he's like, "Well, he owes a debt, and the way it works here is you run with your race." And so in prison, it's truly Jim Crow South, and Asians and Jewish people are protected under um, the black diaspora, and then there's sort of the white card and the Latino card. Um, And those are the three dominant.
The three power groups.
And then there's like two others, I suspect, which is Christian and Muslim. Um, but even they're still dictated a little bit by racial politics as well. So the racial politics are supersede gangs, it supersedes other sort of affiliation. And um, Asian and Jewish people fall under the black card there. And the guy was like, "Look, this isn't up for debate. Like, the reason you'll be safe here is because this entire card is going to protect you, and so you're not going to be allowed to turn your back on it." um and he was like, "You could go to your cell and think about it, and when you come out to the yard again, we'll have the knife and you can stab him, and we'll
Holy shit.
and I'm 18, right?" And he's like, "And we'll make sure you don't get caught. But if you do get caught, you can't snitch either, or else then we're gonna kill you." Got it. This is my option set.
Yeah.
And I walked out to the yard, heart pounding, and he came up to me, handed me a knife. I took the knife and I threw it, and I punched him, and just began to fight him, which was youthful naivety and hubris helped then. Looking back at it, that was probably one of my best decisions, because I
Yeah.
could have irreparably lost my soul, frankly, in that place. And that decision made ensured that I didn't. And so yeah, I fought him. That led to me being sent to solitary confinement for 9 months. I love when I'm at dinners with some of my friends, and we talk about like silent retreats and stuff, and I'm like, man, I was on a silent retreat for 9 fucking months, let me tell you. And I like don't say much about it. I'm just like, Word. Got it. And but yeah, I was in the hole for 9 months, full solitary confinement. All I could do for the first 3 months, frankly, was meditate because they don't allow you at the time, stationary or reading material or anything. So I just sort of sat with my thoughts and myself and exercised daily. Um,
Did you have, I kind of want to dig into that here.
sure.
Like, did you have, I feel like a lot of people probably would just go crazy because they don't have the tools to sit with their thoughts or to like the discipline to exercise. Like, did you have those tools already?
I found them within. My dad had instilled them in me, man. My dad was a brutal teacher in that, like, not harmful, but he did not sugarcoat life for me. So I remember my lesson in South Central to mind my business was a group of guys were fighting, and we were what he called rubbernecking, which was like stretching our necks to see what was happening. And he's like, dude, stop it. And we're like, no, like it's interesting. He's like, there's nothing interesting about like humans harming each other, period. Stop it. And we were like, no. He's like, okay, we're going to drive back around there. And you'll see that this always ends poorly, always. And I remember, and I'm like 11, Justin.
Yeah.
We go to the gas station, we drive back, and the dudes who were fighting, one of them had just been murdered. And he was like, now sit here, look at it, watch it. This is why you don't get involved in this shit. This is not the life for you. And those were his lessons. Like
Yeah.
his like, you up mentally was unthinkable. It was like you will be resilient and kind and learn to lead with grace because the entire world will not treat you this way. So you need to establish your own sense of grace. Um, and so I think when I was sitting in the cell, like I would hear him in his lessons a lot, honestly, and I would exercise a lot and I would sing. It's also one of the biggest moments for like what I believe like humans sort of I started having this belief that the human experience is merely our set of memories, and the moment we lose those memories and can't create those memories anymore, we're sort of devoid of a lot of value. And like a lot of our personal achievements are super cool, and we aspire to bring purpose to our lives that would otherwise be too overwhelming. Of like, why are we here? But like when I was sitting in a cell for so long, quiet, it became so clear how important like the beautiful memories that I had shared growing up were to me. And I could harken back to those and I could play those out in my mind. And then when I was finally able to read our given books, then I could like imagine myself in these different worlds and these different realities. And that all just became like so important and beautiful for me during that time. And so I think that's why I didn't lose it. And then I got moved to another solitary confinement thing. And this was also a beautiful, like, human resiliency that happened uh, right at the lockdowns in quarantine, actually. And it happens every single Friday inside prisons to this day, which is when we had the quarantine, when everyone was told to quarantine, and all those videos started to circulate in Italy of people singing to each other, like the
Hmm.
sing-alongs from house to house, or what was when they did the sing-along of Biggie Smalls in New York. Um,
Yeah.
that happens every Friday in prison. There's like open mics because everyone's in their cell, and you basically quiet the entire cell block, and one person does talent shows. Sometimes it's comedy, some people are singing, some people are telling jokes or stories, and then people are singing together. And I thought that that was a beautiful show of sort of the human resolve, to always want to be connected with one another. So yeah, I think Honestly, community, man, is
Yeah.
why I didn't go crazy. Like when I look at South LA and growing up in Watts, um, a big moment in my childhood was a one of my best friends being murdered right in front of me. And my entire neighborhood came out of their homes and one by one hugged me and reminded me that unfortunately this was our reality, but I would be okay. And they did that for about a year straight. I couldn't walk
Wow.
down my street for a year and not have someone's mother pull me to the side and be like, "How are you today, baby? Give me a hug. It's going to be okay. Are we good?" And when I went into prison, um, it was just this idea of a shared struggle that we all sort of had to get through and make sure we could maintain some relative sanity. A lot of the people who break mentally in prison is because the isolation is so much so that I think you look at the Ezel, is it the Ezel Ford or uh, I'm forgetting the young man's name, Crowder, out in New York, who faced isolation and then came home and ultimately committed suicide. Well, one of the key things that I noticed there was Khalif Crowder, that's his name, is I noticed that inmates had turned on him, which were his peer group. Law enforcement
Yeah.
had turned on him, and society had turned on him. And in the absence of any community, you're broken. The book Lost Connections talks about this too.
Such a good book.
Yeah, it's an incredible book, and it talks about the importance of needing each other, man. And I I experienced this at such a visceral level inside, especially during the moment of being in the hole. And then when I got out the hole, we created this college program, which then I pitched uh, then Governor Schwarzenegger. I wrote a whole proposal, my first pitch deck, and I gave it to my best friend Scott Butnick, who went and screened Hangover One for the Governator, and then slid him my proposal and said, "Hey, this kid that I know is in prison, and he has a proposal to create a college dorm that basically everyone inside the dorm within the prison will be taking a 2 year or 4 year university correspondence course. And the intention there is that everyone a part of the dorm um, are all looking to have a better sense of self and accomplishment for self, um, as well as impact on their community through learning. And the governor agreed to the program and piloted with 30 people. And I think today it serves almost 30,000 people in California.
So that was, I mean, that's kind of a genius idea because it, creates this sense of community, like what you're harkening back to, but also, you create a different peer group within the peer group of people in prison. You've created a peer group of people who are maybe trying to better themselves or figure out a different path after they get out, or maybe it's a, and so like we're all our average of our five best friends, right, or
Correct.
the average of the people around us. So you were able to create your own peer group and community within the greater community and pure set of people in jail or in
Yeah.
prison.
Yeah. I was able to find, to your point, this peer group of like, one of my buddies right now is a physics teacher and he's double major in physics and mathematics. The guy who taught me math inside was an MIT biologist that got in a bar fight and ended up committing manslaughter, but was otherwise fucking brilliant. And these were the people that I was like surrounded around inside the dorm, and older people who were surrogate fathers who could teach me life lessons. And it was just such a cross section of ages and life experience, and that we were able to do. I remember I learned how to play chess there for the first time, and then I started reading books about Kavanaugh, and I was just like lost it and like fell in love with chess. And I never heard of Dungeons and Dragons in South Central. Like, what? Never. And then, like, in this dorm, like, there's a group of people playing this for extended periods of times and having these campaigns. And I'm listening to this narrative building, and I'm like, holy shit, this is brilliant. I'm in. But, like, it was just this, like, beautiful ability to like look at everyone's cultures, look at the unique sort of upbringing, and sort of immerse yourself in this. And there'd be like these guys who are, when you hear them speak, you're like, oh, he's straight, you know, a blood or crip from South LA. And then he puts like pen to paper, and you're like, oh shit, this is like, there's this guy Detroit who's now, you know, multimillionaire trader in Wall Street, and there's one of my good friends who's a neurologist, and who they were all inside with me, and you're like,
Wow.
I'm sitting there around them, and I'm like, these dudes are brilliant, and just didn't have a platform growing up. Oftentimes, I always said prison is a result of both personal failure and societal failure. And in the absence of accountability from both, we always will have a broken system. Um,
Yeah.
and so, and I got to experience this, and we would debate fucking Socrates, and, you know, Socrates versus Tupac, or it was just wild, wild conversations. And, uh, you know, got to learn a lot, and as well as, look, there were tough times, and there were consequences that were, I learned, if you know, if you interact with me enough, you'll learn that, like, I tend to like sit quietly. I don't interrupt people. I purposely am incredibly respectful and kind to people. And I think it's a lot to do with like like the consequences of spouting off at the mouth and being unkind are, you know, there's real consequences connected
Much
to
more
that.
drastic than
Yeah,
maybe in daily life
um,
outside.
big time. And there are, so I was reading this book, Range, and
Yeah.
in the book it talks about these like kind and unkind learning environments. One where you get, kind being one where you get immediate feedback, unkind where it's like prolonged, possibly you don't get feedback. In there, for disrespectful behavior, it is a very kind learning environment.
You get immediate feedback.
Immediate feedback
Yeah.
loop. So yeah, yeah.
Wow.
It's
So
we could go on and on. That the experience was a fascinating experience, truly. If I were an anthropologist, I always said it felt like a microcosm of our society, because every possible personality type you could think of existed there. And you saw pure evil at times. And I'd be like, man, dude, like, you scare me. Um, and you saw, by and large, a lot of people who, uh, you know, through the consequences of war on drugs or poverty or unfair sentencing laws, etc., that had become a cog in this very big system that they couldn't get themselves out of.
are you thankful for that time?
Yeah, I think I'm thankful for. I tend to be thankful for all of my life experiences. Honestly, man, um I watched a guy, Frank, when I was in prison, who had, he had life in. I was around a lot of guys with life in prison. My cellmate,
Yeah.
both of them had life in prison, and so I would always try and get in their mind of like, how do you cope when you know that like this is it, you know? Um, and my cellmate was this beautiful writer. He's home now, through a host of reasons, but this beautiful writer, and I watched like life come out of him through his skill of writing. And then there was Frank, who was broken. His soul was broken. He played dominoes in whatever game that could pass the time, and he was not present at all. He had numbed himself to his reality. He wasn't feeling. And I remember looking at the two and was like, what is the distinctive difference between these two? Where one writes and you talk to him and there's so much life, and the other there isn't. And the biggest thing I saw is that my boy Israel, our that was his poet name, Rocky, um, was just so present, man. He cried when he needed to cry. He, punched a wall if he needed to punch a wall. He smiled when he needed to smile. He showed love when he needed to show love. And he didn't run from the harshness of the experience. And he didn't try and change it, and he didn't try and find things to unhealthily cope with it. Whereas Frank did. And through that experience, that made me begin to shift all of my thinking about life's experiences. It's just like I can exist in a space where something goes wrong, and I'm like, it went wrong, and woe is me. Or I can be like, let me feel this, let me be present. It hurts, it sucks, I'm embarrassed, whatever it is I'm feeling, and appreciate that in that moment. And I think it's made me a better and more resilient entrepreneur, frankly. You catch
For sure.
tough moments. I'm able to like take those tough moments. Like in tough moments, I almost have a like zen level of calm inside of me. Like
Yeah.
I'm unmoved by it. And I think it's a reflection of really watching Rocky and Frank and being like, what is so different between these two? And one had decided not to be present and the other did.
Yeah, it's that mindset shift of moving from life is happening to you and you're a victim.
Yep.
Just things are happening to you, you're the victim of your circumstances and you don't have control, you don't have agency, to the feeling of I have agency, life is happening through me, and I am ultimately the determinant of how I respond to the circumstances that present themselves.
100%. And sometimes you need reminders of that, right? Like more recently, I was talking to a gentleman, Ron Beller, who shared with
Our
me,
mutual friend.
yeah,
Yeah.
who shared with me the idea of like, victim, villain, hero thinking. And I again never had the words to contextualize that, but that's easily a loop that we end up in, right? Like, and when we could shift to this idea of like, I can create. Um, Tupac's idea of the rose that grew from concrete, right? I can create out of the ashes. Um, it's such a powerful mindset, honestly. And that I super fortunate to, I think through South LA and incarceration, like, and I met incredible people, dude. Like, we now have it's probably one of the more powerful justice reform organizations in California, arguably the nation, ARC, the Anti Recidivism Coalition, and basically folks who come out of the college program or firefighting program, they come home and we help them with, if they commit to be drug free, crime free, and committed to their neighborhood or their community in support, we then help with, housing and direct policy advocacy at the Capitol to change laws. But the people that are a part of this group, man, are phenomenal, man. Like they're men and women, and they go from I don't know, Columbia and Harvard to SC to some of the best colleges in the world. And there's a, unlike my dad, I'm a big fan of hip hop. And there's a Nipsey Hussle line in one of his songs that he says, he knew he was a genius, but he didn't have any platforms to explain it when growing up in South LA. And when I look at some of the success that have come out of this program, I'm just like, man, like there's so much brilliance that's being stifled among children all over the world. Like in South LA, in rural areas of poverty where meth is now running rampant and killing off, our frankly our Caucasian population in this country, through poverty. Like in all those areas, there's just incredible human waste that's happening. Um, that,
So
yeah.
when you got out, did you start immediately on the activism side and community organizing?
No, not at all. When I got out, I got accepted to different colleges. They did not let me go to a few of them because of parole, but I got accepted to Loyola Marymount's engineering program, and because I said this earlier, I thought I wanted to be an architect, but knew I'd be broke because I wasn't as creative as I hoped, or at least my ego told me I was anyway. Prison's a good check on the ego constantly. So I was able to like recognize as a kid. I was like, dude, I'm like growing up. I was a little arrogant kid, and prison was able to put a big humility punctuation around that for me. But yeah, I came home, and 2 months after being in prison, I walked onto a college campus to study engineering. And that was a whole new life. Like, I remember my grandfather took me to orientation, and he's like, everyone here is so happy. It makes you just want to slap somebody because they're so happy. And that was true. It was like I went from this space that was like very guarded and protective of my physical body and my mind to this new world that was very open and happy and free. And I was also the grandpa in college because I just turned 22 and I was starting my
Yeah.
sophomore year, right? I was a grandpa, or my junior year. But that was my focus, man. I immediately became um, active in education. I've now met a good amount of celebrities and people of prominence, but I still get like starstruck is this gentleman named Jeffrey Canada, who created this thing called the Harlem Children's Zone out in Harlem. Um, and it's a perfectly executed community building exercise where he said, listen, everyone on this one block will thrive and they will go to college. And he, said, this is what thriving looks like. And he went block by block until there's about 97 blocks today in Harlem where the graduation rate is 100% in high school and 90% or 97% college graduation. They go to
Wow.
a Harlem Children's Zone Academy. And then he started purchasing the homes there with the people there such that they could take ownership of their homes, and community started thriving. The movie Waiting for Superman was made after him. And I remember getting to watch that movie right when I came home. And I was like, while I don't want any kid to experience what I just experienced, and I certainly wish that the criminal justice system was a lot more fair, my focus began to figure out ways to bring education to children where I had grown up. While at the same time, in the back of my head, I still had this longing desire to not go back to the hood, man. I was like, I got to make money. And
Yeah.
so I worked, or I was studying engineering, and then I got a job as an intern with a gentleman named Randy Miller, who I call the Steve Jobs of construction. We were building a fully robotic parking structure in UCLA, or UCLA medical office in Santa Monica. And he's since gone on to, build a really successful modular construction company. And I was a part of the ground floor of building that. And I remember prepping for an interview that he told me uh, he had no position. He's like, I have no job openings, but I'm happy to meet you because my cousin said I should meet you, which also was a big lesson of like how important network is, but also how important like owning the authority of your power. And I don't think
Mm.
like people in leadership actually appreciate how much their words mean, how much they move people. And from my perspective, I was this kid who had just got out of prison. I didn't understand the world. I was in college. I didn't understand that. I was barely learning how to drive. And someone said this guy is building a robotic parking structure. I'm like, I mean, that's the closest thing next to Jesus. Like I don't know. Like you're building a robotic parking structure. That's Jetson level shit 10 years ago, right? So I'm like,
Yeah.
what is happening? I'm excited to meet this guy. And he tells me like, hey, I don't have a job for you, but I'm happy to meet. And during the interview, I was very honest. My first job actually was at Hollister, and I lied about my criminal background. And I would walk
Yeah.
into the store and look at everyone's faces before each shift to figure out who had actually who had figured out that I had been incarcerated that day, and it stressed me out to no end. And then I quit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was like, I'm never gonna hide this ever again. Like this is brutal. I can't hide this anymore. Um, and That was my dad just peeked his head in. I was like, I can't hide this anymore. And Randy, luckily, was he was very like, man, it I think it reaffirmed my humanity, honestly, is what I always say. Is I sat with an interview with him. And by the end of this interview and conversation, he and his partner looked at me and said, man, we can't afford not to hire you.
Yeah.
And it was just such a massive shift in my thinking as an entrepreneur and audacity, honestly. Was these two dudes who I saw bigger than life, and they were all of 26 at the time. And
Oh, wow.
I saw them as bigger than life. Um, and they were like, yeah, like we would be foolish not to hire you. And you don't have any skills in engineering or anything, but we believe in you. And that led to me working for them as an intern. And then they fired the superintendent, which is the person who's like a movie producer, right? They're leading the day-to-day workings of the job. And there's like 300 people on a job site of this size that you're managing. And I remember they fired him. And I was like, Randy, like a kid, like, Randy, can I try? I want to try to do this job. And he was like, yeah, sure. You know, we'll hire someone in a couple weeks. And it turned out I just had a, a knack, I think, to lead people, to push schedules quicker than they needed them to be pushed, to listen to them such that they're heard, but still uh, get what I needed done at the same time, and treat people with humanity and respect despite their where their job was. And that was a big, while I didn't have experience of how to build this building the most efficient, I had enough humility to listen to the people that did, to respect their lives and their life experience, but also push them to do more. And so they never hired a new superintendent, started getting paid a lot more. And I was working full time for Randy and going to school full time. And I finally started making money, man. And
Yeah.
that that became a good addiction, honestly. Initially, I was making money. I could take care of my family. I then went on to build Ace Hotel in downtown LA and um, help with the modular stuff and just different construction projects throughout LA. And I'd see these physical manifestations of success. Um, and I had money and I moved out of the hood. Uh, And then I just started feeling a terrible emptiness, honestly, man. And I was just like, I got money. I have a group of neighbors that don't want to talk to me, and I don't really need to talk to them. They don't need to talk to me. There's no like poverty level need here.
Yeah.
And then I still was watching children being sort of chewed up in our system, and communities being occupied. And that led me to run for office. Uh,
Yeah.
I was
So you
like,
just decided, like, how old were you?
I was 25, I guess, at the time when I decided
Yeah.
that I would run for the California State Assembly, which is like bigger than a lot of U.S. congressional districts, like federal congressional
Right.
running for office in California. Um, yeah, but I was like, look, I'm going to bring uh, leadership to our community. I'm sick of the guys leading this that like led from a deficit space of needing money, etc. And I was like, I'm gonna change that, and go back to where I'd grown up and be a part of community building. Um, and there's a lot of good that came of that. Like I was able to. One of the things that I thought elected officials in our area didn't fully appreciate, which again is the power of leadership. And I quickly realized that me just running for office, I didn't even hold office yet, just running for
Yeah.
office, I ended up with this like, I don't know, power that was granted on me. It was like, cool. And I could call, a partner at CAA and say, hey, can we shut down CAA and let's do a remake or remodel of a school? And they'd be like, yeah. And I'd be like, ah. And it started clicking to me that the like power of influence that office could hold was so important to communities like this. Um, and so I was able to create a college program, or sorry, a camp program for kids in the community. And I remember officers being like, "We have to be the camp counselors because we're going to be a good influence to the kids." And then people who had grew up in the gangs were like, "No, we need to be the camp counselors because we know these kids. Like the hood knows
Yeah.
them." And I was like, "Neither of you are going to be the camp counselor for these kids. I need like bubbly, loving kids from Loyola SC and college, like any other camp institution in the
Right.
world. Like that's what our babies need. Like let's start treating them as babies and normal." Um, and yeah, it was in running for office, and then I won the primary, and I was like, oh yeah, for sure, this is it. I'm gonna win the general. I'm this like political unknown. I'd walk into fundraisers, and my fundraiser would be like, yo, dude, Matt Damon and Steven Spielberg are here to see you. And I'd be like, who's Matt Damon? And he's like, where have you been? I'm like, dude, in jail. What do you mean? I don't watch movies. But all of these different people would show up at these fundraisers and be deeply supportive. And it looked like I was going to win the election until 3 days before the election. My opponent photoshopped a picture of me with a hood and a gun and said ex cop versus ex con. It was a complete, uh, you know, it,
Political low blow.
it was a massive low blow. But that people are still afraid of young black kids with hoods and guns, and uh, and so I end up losing that election. But um, still I still was able to build community and got a crazy call right after the election from President Obama and Michelle Obama's staff inviting me to the State of the Union for work I had done in justice reform and being a part of decreasing crime and police brutality and occupation in Watts in South LA. And at that moment I was talking to the president and said, I'm really good at this construction real estate development thing. I've built a strong skill set here. And I love it. I love seeing buildings take lives of their own, but I really care about building community and bringing people together in a supportive and loving way. And his thought was figure out a way to do both. And you know, since
So you did
I've
that.
since been on a mission to do that. Yeah.
So how did, I guess that is like culmination of almost everything we've talked about in your story,
Hmm.
from what you loved about growing up to finding your purpose inside,
Yep.
and then, the engineering background with your dad as a builder, and then, the first job out of college and what you studied in college. And so it seems like the perfect, Treehouse is like the perfect uh, mission for you in a way. Can you tell everybody about what it is?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Like Treehouse for me was a massive combination of all my life experiences, right? Like um, once I started making money, I got a house in Playa Vista, and it was with some of my best friends. And we had our own bedrooms and our own bathrooms, and we designed it really, really well. Uh, and put money into it, and we loved living with each other, and there was nothing lacking by the way we were living. It was beautiful, and some of my friends were making less than the others, and some of us made more, and we offset relative to what we were making, not relative to the square footage of the bedroom that we would take, a master or otherwise. Um and in living this way, and my daughter living in this space, and just how just awesome it was, like hosting dinners and hanging out with each other, um, I started thinking just more and more, how could I bring this world to other people, and thinking back of like after watching my mom shoot up heroin, or my best friend die, or like me sitting in the hole for 9 months and being in prison. Like, how the fuck haven't I gone crazy? Um, and I kept concluding that like community had wrapped its arms around me in a very authentic way. It didn't ask me to be something I wasn't. It didn't set like preset rules on what my deportment was. It instead said, we appreciated your culture and we love you and believe in you. And that was important, man, for me, in thinking about Treehouse. And so I I just completed building a restaurant called Local with Roy Choi and Daniel Patterson. Roy Choi is a like celebrity chef, and Daniel Patterson was the two-star Michelin chef of Qua in San Francisco. And the three of us, the two of them came up with an idea, and I built the physical space for the idea in Watts.
That was in Oakland, right? Oh, it was in Watts.
The
Yeah.
first one was in Watts, and then it went to Oakland, then it went to San Jose, and what's the spot in San Francisco? Starts with a T.
The Tenderloin.
Yeah, exactly, the Tenderloin. Um, and the whole idea was to bring healthy fast food to underserved areas. But while I was building this restaurant, I basically took a sabbatical from my day-to-day job as a developer. And they were like, can we build this? We told all our investors we'd build this in 2.5 months. We don't have a structure. And can this be possible? And I was like, well, like, I mean, I can apply the same building rules that we do for skyscrapers and that level of speed. I'm sure we could build a restaurant in 2.5 months. And so I did. And to add to the challenge, I basically 90% of the people that worked there were all from the neighborhood. And then following on, once the place was built, Roy Choi had an application for a job. And that application only had your name and your address. And if you could show that you lived in the area, you were hired.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, this is such a beautiful effort of building community through capitalism. And that's where I just started thinking like, man, what if I could use physical space to create community? We spend a tremendous amount of our time either at work or at home. Now it's at home. But back then it was work or home. And what if home felt like the hugs that I received the day I had the most difficult moment in my life? And what if home felt like the moment I'll always remember this moment that I was released, and it's 5 a.m. They call my name. To this point, I didn't believe I would be released. It's so surreal. And they call my name at 5 a.m. in the morning, and I'm walking down the middle of the dorm, and everyone there had like woken up at 5 a.m. and started clapping and cheering and giving me a hug by 100 people I walked through. Um, and I was like, wow, man, like there's no feeling like that. Like these became your family, your friends, people who appreciated what you had done and appreciated you. And it just made me think of like, how can I use physical space to recreate these moments, these memories that I concluded was core to human existence, which was memories in these little moments. How do you create a space that's centered around moments of serendipity and connection, and not
Yeah.
just building a soulless building that generates capital, and how can I generate capital and create soul? And I heard about utilizing increased density. I was somewhat biased, frankly, coming from a very dense place, a cell that's like 80 square feet, maybe less, and realizing that I just don't need much space, but also looking at other parts of the world that didn't utilize or place such an emphasis on space, but more of connection and eating together and talking to my cellmate for a long time was a Laotian guy, Pisa, and Pisa would just, I mean, the stories he would tell me, like he immigrated here, and the stories he would tell me um, about Laotia and China as well were just so beautiful and like connected, and I was like, how do we bring this together? And I made my first pitch to Michael Birch, who's founder of the Battery, and the pitch was pretty simple. It was I wanted to build a physical space where people could rent apartments. They could either rent them as roommates, or they could rent them as individual units. We would shrink the indoor living space and bring it out to the common areas to provide more moments of serendipity and community. And we would also, while shrinking the indoor living space, but being very intentional and focused about your personal private space, your room or your studio. Looking at soundproofing and looking at individual ACs and the things that cause friction among friends that otherwise shouldn't be a friction point in a friendship or a relationship at all. Like, I don't know, my girlfriend and I, or wife and I, one day it should never be a situation where like we're fighting over AC controls and that becomes a thing that underpins our relationship, right? Because it turns out we actually don't know how to fight with one another, but we think we're upset over the AC. It's like, it's silly. And so looking at some of the things that we could utilize technology and engineering and thoughtful building to take out the friction points of friendship, but allow for people to get to know one another and pick one another as they live in these places, such that you don't live 5 feet away in a luxury apartment that's literally where your doors are 5 to 10 feet apart, and you don't know your neighbor. Like, it's crazy. That's not a society that can last, in my opinion. I also have a
Yeah.
big belief that like humans need to figure out fast how to distinguish themselves from robots. And I think the only way to do that is through community and proximity with one another, and having very localized interactions. And like, there's no point of fearing technology. We just need to like respect it and respect that, there's this place for humans and them. And so, yeah, so Treehouse ended up being this sort of amalgamation of all these. You can rent an individual bedroom and bathroom in a 5-bedroom suite, or you can rent a studio or a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom. But all the neighbors go through a full application process of things of like, what do you want to the community, letting that be a baseline for leasing here. How will you show up? How do you want to be supported? Because there is a reciprocal nature to connection. Um, as well as what are some of the living style standards that you have that could be annoying, and then we try and use that, all of that information in the application to connect people that want to live together. And once you're in here, there's weekly Sunday dinners, and there's Saturday brunches, and there's hosted speaker series, and a lot of the things that you would see in a private members club naturally happens here. A lot of the residents themselves should be on speaking tours. Early on we had Patrice Cullors, one of the premier faces of the Black Lives Matter and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, who lived here. And just a host of different people that are interesting and excited about life and connecting with each other. And so that's the start of Treehouse. The future of Treehouse is building as many of these buildings, and vessels is what I call them, of community that bring people together all throughout the U.S. and the world, that focuses at a very hyper localized way. The coronavirus has only accelerated our need to be connected like no other. Everyone's talking about like, who's going to be my pod, and like, am I going to live with a pod? Well, this building, we haven't shut down common spaces, etc., and people have, there's 50 plus people that are all in a pod together, and they're living life fully. They're able to work from home, and then after work they're able to bop down to the cafe and jump into a conversation about AI or, Queen's Gambit, and whatever is relevant in that moment. And as Treehouse grows and builds, and we have an ecosystem of community members, from the residents who live in the building. And if you're a resident in any building that Treehouse builds, you become a resident in all of our buildings. So you can go to the different common spaces and working spaces and interact with people. And then we also touch into the local community and our extended, like Justin, as a investor in Treehouse, like, you're part of our overall community. And people will see you as such, and us really saying how important it is to respect people's cultures and differences. Like, we have one of LA's most popular hip DJs, woman DJs here.
Yeah.
And then there's someone who like is this brilliant like AI technology gentleman. And just out of nowhere, serendipitously, they're full on salsa dancing together one night. That then turned and turned into salsa classes hosted by the two of them, two worlds that would otherwise never interact. And you just see this happening so much at Treehouse. And I think that's the future, redefining what the American dream is. And it's not pure individualism. It's literally about community and coming together. I think that's the future of humanity, frankly. And we're building physical vessels for people to operate in that way.
That's beautiful. Do you feel that, it seems like this is in the zeitgeist now, that so many people are talking about, for so long, like you said, the American dream is a specific thing. It's, house, a suburban house, where you can raise your own family, and you kind of like, you have to drive to everything, but you have your own space. And maybe more and more, as we've seen this rise of millennials that want to live in the city and stay in the city longer. And there's been this, wave of interest in new urbanism. People are looking for something different and are creating these co-living spaces that maybe are trying to define how you interact with your neighbors differently. Like, is this like a moment in time in how people want to live, and where there's like changing preferences?
I think so. I think that there's a lot of, if you look at it from like pitching, right? There's the problem statement, and if we have our problem statement, I think that technology moved faster than we appreciated it could, and it started to pull us apart from one another, in very tangible ways, and it created this sort of pseudo connection. And like Tristan Harris talks a lot about this in the social media documentary. I believe he spoke here at Treehouse as well about this. And I think that I personally, and I don't know if this, I don't think it's a popular opinion, frankly, but I'm going to say my opinion, which is I think that the idea of like-mindedness is hogwash. And I think it has divided us to no end. And we have very narrowly defined these sort of categories that we identify with, i.e., right, left, I'm a rocker, I'm a tech person, blah, blah, blah. And then somehow try to attach the entire person to these categories. And if someone isn't like minded or representative in one of these categories, they're somehow opposed to you. And I think that that's created like such a terrible divide in our society. And what I learned in, just because I love sneakers and I'm a sneakerhead, which I am,
Yeah.
I equally love Dungeons and Dragons. And I equally love Nipsey Hussle and opera music and country music. And I understand points of views on the right that I fully agree with, and I understand points of views on the left that I fully agree with, and some I disagree with deeply. And that's the full complexity of the human being. It can't be diminished to some like-mindedness necessarily. And I think when we look at that, how this plays out, we see a world that's divided by rancor, that's really harmful, and we end up being separated as a result of it. And I just recently became a scout for Sequoia, and we were talking about marketplaces and like are there any future emerging marketplaces? And there was a conversation around this idea of community as being one of the sort of emerging marketplaces. And I do think there's a time in history that people are feeling so disconnected that we're trying to find ways to connect with each other. But we're also realizing the power of us as together, like the power of sharing, the fact that there is an entire sharing economy. When I look at Treehouse, I'm like, man, like if we could do this at scale, like companies like Uber and Airbnb and others have like a real problem on their hands, because there's a internal car sharing program that happens in Treehouse. They share bikes here. They go shopping for each other sometimes here. If a friend needs a place to stay, and you can imagine 30 of these buildings throughout the US one day, and I could just go in our internal chat and say, hey, anyone in New York has an available unit this weekend, and I can just pop over. When you're in community with each other, sharing becomes incredibly easy and efficient. But I think in the absence of that, we have a culture right now that's looking at community in the zeitgeist, knowing it's something that we want right now. I think more and more we're realizing that it has to be something that's local. and very
Yeah.
proximate. And I think COVID has punctuated that for us. You know, we had all these big, like Soho House or other big communities. I don't know. Think of anyone that you want. Um, and frankly, with the absence, or the only real online communities that I think are probably flourishing as much, that that sort of stayed the same and maybe they've increased, is places like Twitch that have allowed for people to like communicate in a very real time way as they share in a experience. But uh, people are dying to hug each other again, to talk to each other, but they also don't trust uh, necessarily like that they haven't been contacted with other people, and so just being able to trust your neighbor becomes super important.
It's beautifully said.